So, got it. Okay. So I guess the first thing I would say is that, if you're interested in partaking in using the psychedelics to heal, there's more to it than just signing up for, in my opinion, signing up for something and going and doing it. You really should put some time and energy and thought into what that entails. Do a bit of research, even do some prep of work on yourself to be ready for, because what happens in these spaces is really hard to predict, can be enormously challenging. Read about my experience, which, I would suggest was one of the most difficult things I've ever experienced. Also one of the most therapeutically beneficial, but very, very challenging. And so, yeah, just, do your due diligence, I would say, if you're interested in pursuing this as a form of healing. And there's things you can do to prep, and I'll talk a little bit about that at the end of my talk. So I'm going to go ahead and read this because it's pretty dense and I don't want to miss anything important. I don't normally read my talks, but this is one I like to do that for. So this talk I was originally given in 2017 at the Plant Spirit Medicine Conference here at UBC. If you've never been to Vancouver or to Vancouver, I would highly recommend coming to this conference once COVID's over and we can attend certain things. It's one of my favorite conferences. I presented in 2017 to probably this talk to probably, I don't know, 150 people, and the last one, just really talking about how the attention on this matter has changed. The last one we held in person was in 2019, and there were over 500 people there. So it's really grown, and it's a really fun conference. Really, like some of the top names in psychedelic medicine and psychedelics in the psychedelic community show up there and present there. So yeah, I'd highly recommend that. So I presented this first there and a few times since. So I'm just going to jump in. First, I'd like to say I'm incredibly grateful to be able to share my perspectives on psychedelic medicine with your student group. In this talk, I will be integrating understandings I have gleaned from the disciplines of neuroscience, psychology, and shamanism to explore the role that psychedelics can play in emotional healing. That's been a real focus of my life since I was a young adult. I want to state up front that I am not an expert at neuroscience or psychology or shamanism. My training is actually in political science, but my intent today is to share one of my gifts, namely the ability to look across the realms of science, healing, and spirituality with an open and curious mind, and in the process, perhaps connect some dots for those interested in experiencing or facilitating sustained deep emotional healing. It's something our culture does not understand very well. I would say that emotional issues drive most of our mental health and addictions issues. That's my opinion. So this work is super, super important. And again, although it's not my usual style, I'm going to read the presentation because I have a lot of ground to cover in a short time and therefore have taken great care in my choice of words. So let's start in the world of neuroscience, shall we? I think it's probably obvious to all of us that the experience we call human awareness results from the interplay between our conscious thinking selves and our sentient feeling selves. These components of awareness are housed in different parts of the brain, and through the advances of neuroscience, we're now gaining rudimentary scientific understandings of how our thinking and feeling selves interact on a physical level in the brain to create what we call awareness. Based on the best available data and modeling of brain activity, it's becoming clear that our subjective experience of reality, that is our awareness, results from the dynamic interaction between bottom-up sensory information coming from our feeling selves, that's really our body, and top-down projections coming from our thinking selves that interpret these incoming sensations based on previous experience. That's our thinking selves. For most people, most of the time, the frontal cortex sits at the top of the neural hierarchy, sending strong projections that modulate and constrain information coming from our feeling selves to our conscious awareness. What we're aware of in terms of physical senses is modulated by our conscious kind of a gatekeeper often. Now, when neuroscientists first started imaging brains on psychedelics, they were surprised because they fully expected to see very large increases in brain activity given the intense experiences reported by users. What they found instead were areas of significantly reduced neural activity from normal, especially in the frontal regions of the brain, the parts mainly associated with our conscious thinking selves. This led scientists to compare neural activity across brain regions, and they have since documented significant increases in activity in posterior regions of the brain, corresponding with the decreased activity in the observed frontal regions. These posterior regions are the parts of the brain associated mainly with emotional and visual processing. So what the heck is going on? The not newest anymore, but the newest in 2017 research recently published from Spain suggests that psychedelics can induce, and this is a quote, a temporary disruption of neural hierarchy, unquote, where our conscious thinking selves, which for most of us dominate in our day-to-day awareness, lose they call quote unquote cognitive grip that it exerts over our sentient feeling selves. These findings suggest that these substances induce a reversal of information flow in the brain that allows access to, again a quote, weak endogenous activity originating in the parts of the brain associated with emotions. In other words, these medicines can provide access to feelings locked out of our conscious awareness due to the top-down control our thinking selves typically exercise over our perception. In the extreme, this locking out effect is what psychologists call disassociation or emotional compartmentalization. We are unaware of sensations really emanating from the body. For those of you who have some understandings of shamanic healing, which is a very different topic now, I believe emotional compartmentalization is a version of what shamans call soul loss, which, as I understand it, is a loss of essence or awareness usually associated with trauma of some sort. To personalize this, I'll ask all of you to take a moment and think back on your own lives to a challenging experience where you were never quite the same afterwards. See if you can identify in your history an experience that you've been through that changed you, that you were never quite the same afterwards. From a shamanic perspective, they would say it's very likely that you experienced a loss or a compartmentalization of emotional awareness, a soul loss in that experience, similar to what I'm describing here. I believe that the cognitive grip we exert over our emotional selves results fundamentally from mental judgments we hold that rigidly interpret some feelings as good, i.e. joy, and some feelings as bad, grief. Based on these judgments, we are imprinted to seek out and express good emotions and imprinted to avoid and suppress bad emotions. On a practical level, this means that for many of us, our nervous systems have not developed the capacity to feel and productively express the so-called bad emotions like grief. However, I think it's important to consider that at their most basic level, emotions are just chemical and electrical signals in the body. That's all they are. You chemists would know this. It is our socially and culturally conditioned minds that interpret certain feelings, sensations as bad, leading us to avoid, suppress any extreme, and disassociate them. This avoidance, in turn, means that most of us, as we grow up, don't develop much real capacity to productively interact with the so-called challenging emotions, and therefore are not very good at feeling and expressing them in healthy ways. When you think about it, it's this crazy catch-22 where we don't develop the capacity to be present for and express certain human feelings like fear. And then because of our lack of experience and capacity to manage fear, we end up habitually compartmentalizing this emotion because we aren't capable of feeling or expressing it in healthy or productive ways. The good news is that there's ways to increase our capacity to remain present for and productively express strong emotions like intense anger. In the main, these involve carefully practicing being present for stronger and stronger feelings until eventually it's possible to experience something like loss, intense loss, without gapping into the unconscious realm of depression. As you can imagine, this work is quite delicate because we are literally working at the boundary between the conscious and unconscious, and in the presence of powerful and often not very helpful social and neurological imprints about those sensations. In terms of practical approaches for enhancing emotional resiliency, mindfulness, if you've got a mindfulness practice, with its focus on acceptance and being present in the moment, is one discipline I've found that can help increase the capacity to experience and stay present for strong emotional energy. I practice Kundalini yoga, which is another practice I've found helpful because it actually trains our nervous system to be comfortable in uncomfortableness through the intentional use of challenging breathwork, mantra, and movement. And this point is actually very important if you're considering going and doing a ceremony. You want to, on my view, you want to prep yourself so that you can go into this experience and basically just be present for, surrender to, totally accept whatever comes up. Because if these medicines are working, they're going to take you to the last thing you want to feel. Absolutely. They'll think of it in your mind. What is the last thing you want to feel? It'll take you right to that because your conscious mind doesn't want you to feel that for good reason. It's difficult. It's hard. It's not pleasant. But you have to have the capacity to do that if you want these medicines to really help shift. It's one of the things that's required. All right. And just how does all this relate to the kind of deep healing that I'm discussing today? To answer this, I will step away from the world of neuroscience and into the realm of psychology for a moment. Here's how I think it works. When we encounter an experience that elicits an emotional response, a physical response, emotional like fear, anger, grief, that threatens to overwhelm our consciousness. If our consciousness thinks that's going to overwhelm us, our minds can respond to that stimulus by disassociating an aspect of us that feels this sensation to separate it from our conscious thinking selves. This is what the shamans call soul loss. You're literally fragmenting a piece of your awareness off to contain that sensation that's threatening to overwhelm you. However, it's well understood that disassociated aspects of ourselves can and do influence our us, even if they are not integrated into our conscious awareness. In fact, they do it from the unconscious. The degree to which these compartmentalized aspects of our awareness affect our day-to-day life is directly proportional to the amount of awareness that is fragmented off in the trauma. Here I'm speaking from experience. Sometimes it's a relatively small aspect of us compared to our total awareness, and sometimes it's a relatively large aspect. I believe that the younger we are when we experience trauma, overwhelming trauma, the more likely that significant aspects of us can be lost to our consciousness in this way. We're literally losing parts of our awareness to fragment off and contain the experience. This brings up the importance of doing all we can to protect infants and small children from experiencing significant trauma. And this is a topic that's been discussed by Dr. Gabor Mate, if you guys know his work and some of his work on addiction. For my part, I'm convinced that persistent mental and emotional problems like depression, anxiety, and PTSD can result when relatively large parts of our emotional awareness get locked away from our thinking selves to reside in what have been described to me by one of my mentors as the unconscious realms. According to my mentor, these realms are dominated almost completely by emotional energy, and this means there is little or no conscious awareness, conscious intent, if you want to think of it that way, that could be used present in these spaces, these emotional spaces. To put this in psychological terms, there are unconscious realms where we compartmentalize sadness that create what we call depression. There are unconscious realms where we compartmentalize anger that create what we call blind rage. There are unconscious realms where we compartmentalize fear that create what we call severe anxiety. A key understanding about all this is that sometimes the aspects of us trapped in these unconscious emotional realms can't return to our conscious awareness on their own. They're not capable of that. As it was explained to me, if the trauma and resulting disassociation are significant enough, the trapped parts of us don't have the ability to spontaneously free themselves from these unconscious realms because they literally know no other experience except for what they are feeling in that realm. They are relegated by our imprinted minds to an unconscious existence defined almost entirely by the emotional energy in that realm, and therefore don't have the presence to free themselves to return to the light of our consciousness on their own. However, these aspects can and do unconsciously influence our perspectives, choices, and behaviors through what I call undercurrent influences. And of course, sometimes these trapped parts can drag our conscious selves into the realms of unconscious feeling, a fact that anyone who's experienced deep depression, debilitating anxiety, or blind rage can attest. When those kinds of strong sensations take over, there's almost no room for any other experience but that feeling. Another interesting way that we can recover parts of us trapped in unconscious realms is for our thinking selves, our conscious selves, to go in and get them. I have come to believe that one of the ways we do this is by unconsciously magnetizing to ourselves circumstances that elicit feelings of similar tone and intensity to the ones in the realm where our emotional aspects are trapped. To recover an aspect of our emotional awareness trapped in intense grief, for example, we may draw into our lives circumstances that elicit feelings of loss like those felt by our compartmentalized aspect. Once we feel into our physical bodies sensations that closely match, once we feel in our physical bodies sensations that closely match those felt by our aspects that are trapped, we gain access to and merge with them and bring them out to hopefully reintegrate them into our conscious awareness. The trick to this process, as I understand it, is to maintain the focus and responsibility to engage in the healing process rather than slip into an unhelpful pattern of disassociation, blame, and victimhood. These understandings align with the teachings of many spiritual masters who have long suggested that all the significant life challenges contain within them potent opportunities for healing. Many spiritual traditions talk about this, that it's not what happens to you, it's what you do with what happens to you that matters, for example. I believe that recapitulating compartmentalized aspects of our emotional awareness is exactly the healing that these masters were referring to in this important teaching. Thankfully, there are less trying ways to recover our aspects trapped in unresolved emotional trauma than drawing to ourselves potentially overwhelming life circumstances. For example, there are shamanic healers who have trained themselves to enter these realms on behalf of clients and negotiate the return of disassociated awareness. There are therapists who work with Gestalt, narrative, and expressive therapies who can also assist clients with this kind of healing. One modality that I've recently become aware of that I believe works at these levels is something called acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, for those of you who may be familiar with this approach. Relating all this back to, to the neurobiology of psychedelics, it appears as though these medicines can aid us in the recapitulation of disassociated emotional awareness by pharmacologically removing our cognitive grips and thereby providing us access to awareness trapped in unresolved emotional trauma. And what is the best way to recover these aspects once we gain access to them with the help of these medicines? By accepting and loving them as best we can. And what is the best way to show these parts of ourselves that we accept and love them? By surrendering to and feeling what they feel as deeply and as authentically as possible in ceremony. I'll say it again for emphasis. I believe that one of the most effective ways for our thinking conscious selves to demonstrate acceptance and love for emotional aspects that we previously denied into our unconscious is to feel and be consciously present for the emotions that our minds previously rejected while in the throes of trauma. Surrendering to and accepting the feelings that our trapped aspects are immersed in allows our conscious selves to merge with them, and this means we can bring them back into the light of consciousness once again as part of us. It's the recovery of consciousness we're talking about here. So I can give you an example from my own healing that may help explain all this a little better. When I was 2 years old, my family of origin imploded when my mother abandoned me. My father, my 5 brothers and sisters without warning or goodbye. I was eventually taken by family services, and after about 2 years, adopted by my great aunt and uncle who raised me into adulthood. As a toddler, my psyche and neurology were completely overwhelmed with the trauma of being abandoned in this way by my primary caregiver. My 2-year-old self had to make sense of these circumstances, and he did so by doing what most young children do. He interpreted it to be about him. And that is, I internalized the belief that I wasn't good enough. I have no conscious memory of these events. I was 2 years old, but could literally write a book about how this early and fundamental trauma has affected my life, including how it is manifested in me as a compulsive need to prove my worth, especially to those close to me. This all came to a head for me several summers ago when I started working with various people to address my abandonment trauma through counseling, body work, and other forms of healing. 4 years ago, so it would have been now 8 years ago, in September, I saw a trusted healer for some shamanic healing the day before I was to participate in an ayahuasca ceremony. It wasn't my first ceremony. And we did some great work that included connecting my soul, in shamanic terms, with the divine feminine as a way to help heal my mother's abandonment of me. In the ceremony the next night, ayahuasca ceremony the next night, I was flirting around the edges of this trauma when one of the ayahuasqueros, the facilitators, came to me to do a tobacco clearing. They use tobacco a lot in these ceremonies. At the end of the clearing, the curandera woman leaned over and said, "I want you to remember these words and repeat them to yourself as often as you can remember. I'm good enough and there's nothing to prove." This is the words she gave me. Immediately after she left my side in the ceremony, the medicine came on very intensely. And I found myself sinking deeper and deeper into a place where there was no other thought, no other experience, no other sensation. I mean, nothing but the thought, mommy doesn't love me, I'm not good enough. For some period of time during the ceremony, under the influence of ayahuasca, that was hard for me to gauge, all I knew, all that I felt, all that existed, and I mean all that existed, was that phrase, mommy doesn't love me, I'm not good enough, and the sensations that came over me. No words can describe the heartache and self-loathing that I felt as I merged with the 2-year-old aspect of my awareness that my mind had compartmentalized off to contain this overwhelming emotional trauma. I accepted and remained present with the intense feelings as best I could for as long as I could. And after some time, the sensations became a little less intense, and I eventually remembered the mantra that the curandera had just given me. At that point, I started repeating over and over, I'm good enough and there's nothing to prove. I'm good enough and there's nothing to prove. I'm good enough and there's nothing to prove. Eventually, I found myself back consciously in the ceremony again and able to perceive what was taking place around me. During that experience, I was someplace else. Amazingly, at that point, I distinctly felt and heard this 2-year-old aspect of myself within me. He was bewildered and utterly crushed, but he was with me and very grateful to be out of the unconscious realm where he had been trapped for 49 years. For a few weeks after the ceremony, I was distinctly aware of this 2-year-old part of myself within my larger awareness. In the beginning, it was strange because I would be doing something normal in my current adult life, and I'd sense this little part of me reacting as if he had never experienced what I was just doing. For example, one day I was driving our car and I could feel that this part of me was a little afraid, but also quite curious about what was happening. Since that time, I found it quite challenging to integrate this little emotional aspect of myself into my larger awareness for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that I'm a crazy busy professional and my work-a-day world is much too mental and stressful for him. We have good days and not so good days. What I've learned from all of this is that the process of integration is vitally important for this kind of deep emotional healing because the unrecovered or the recovered parts of us can easily slip back into the unconscious realms if they don't genuinely feel welcome in our day-to-day worlds. To put differently, if we don't explicitly and diligently work to create genuine emotional space for our recovered aspects, when we go back to our lives outside of the ceremony, the cognitive grip can quite easily return, causing us to recompartmentalize them because they don't fit in with the lives we created not having them. Suffice to say that sometimes fundamental life changes may be required to create the space our recovered aspects require to remain present with us after such ceremonies. Up to now, I've been largely using my mind to engage your mind, something that I always feel feels a bit odd given that the gifts of psychedelics, as I understand them, reside mainly in the realm of emotions, at least in the case of ayahuasca. So to end, I'd like to share a passage that I think poetically and emotionally summarizes the perspectives I attempted to share here. The passage is from the book The Prophet by Khalil Gibran and is called On Pain. In the book, a wise teacher who is preparing to leave a village he's lived in for a long time is summoned one last time to share his wisdom with the community. In the sharing, various people ask questions which the sage answers. One of the onlookers asks about pain, and this is what the prophet says. Your pain is the breaking of the shell that encloses your understanding. Even as the stone of the fruit must break, that its heart may stand in the sun, so must you know pain. And could you keep your heart in wonder at the daily miracles of your life, your pain would not seem less wondrous than your joy. And you would accept the seasons of your heart, even as you have always accepted the seasons that pass over your fields. And you would watch with serenity through the winters of your grief. Much of your pain is self-chosen. It is the bitter potion by which the physician within you heals your sick self. Therefore, trust the physician and drink his remedy in silence and tranquility, for his hand, though heavy and hard, is guided by the tender hand of the unseen capital U. And the cup he brings, though it burn your lips, has been fashioned of the clay which the potter, capital P, has moistened with his own sacred tears. So based on that, I have some suggestions for increasing, if you're thinking about doing this kind of work. First of all, I can say that, you know, this experience was among the most important in my life. It's actually hard to convey all that came from it, because it took years for me to sort of really understand and sort of work in, you know, the changes in my life, but huge differences in how I actually sort of experience life, and all for the better for the most part. There have been some other challenges, but I think it's part of the same process. But so here's some suggestions for increasing the likelihood of a deep emotional healing experience from psychedelic medicines. First, before the ceremony, I recommend practicing mindfulness meditation to cultivate acceptance for feelings and being present in the moment. That's what mindfulness says. I'm going to be right here, right now, feeling exactly what I feel, and I'm not going to judge that. I'm not going to run away from it. I'm not going to distract myself. I'm just going to be totally present and accepting for what emerges. I would just suggest practicing a form of yoga. The form I practice is Kundalini, or other physical disciplines that enhance nervous system capacity, so you can learn how to be comfortable in uncomfortableness. Number three, I'd say identify and release mental judgments, especially judgments against the so-called challenging emotions you might have. If you're really shy, if your conscious awareness is very shy of anger or sadness or fear, in particular, those are the biggies, you need to do something to work on the capacity of the nervous system to kind of house those sensations, and your ability just to be present for those sensations. You can learn a very simple yet powerful practice for releasing mental judgments on a website that I have listed here. If you're interested, I can send this over. I would say practice some shamanic journeying or some other form of interest or shifting your perspective to non-ordinary realities, because what happens in these ceremonies is totally idiosyncratic. I'm describing what I think is sort of one of the underlying mechanisms of healing that can come from a psychedelic experience. But how that shows up for you or anybody who wants to do this is like, you can't predict it. You literally can't predict it. Sometimes people will have experiences that take them right back into a trauma. I talked to one gentleman after a ceremony, and he said that he had gotten malaria and almost died when he was in Central America. And when the medicine came on, he went right back into that feeling, right back into the feeling he had of almost dying when he had malaria. Again, I think trying to, so what I'm saying is you can't predict what's going to happen. It's completely, but if you practice sort of having placing your awareness in various places, like shamanic journeying is one, you can do it with drums, you can do it with other things. You get kind of used to not being, in your prefrontal cortex all the time. You want to learn how to navigate non-ordinary reality, because you're going to be right in it if you do ayahuasca, very likely. You want to develop ongoing relationships with the ceremony facilitators and other participants to enhance the sense of and actual safety, because there are crazy things go on in these spaces. I've heard of, you've probably read some of the stories of what happens down in Peru and stuff. You should follow the dieta and other guidelines for as long as feasible before participating in the ceremony to reduce strong stimulus and recover natural sensitivities. So if you were to sign up for a ceremony, they would likely tell you to not eat strongly flavored foods, especially as you get closer to the ceremony for up to a week. They want to basically, what they're doing, not watch violent television or movies. Basically, they want you to recover your sensitivity. And the way this works is, we're just inundated in our society with stimulus from violence, pornography, you name it. There's just all of these really strong influences on our awareness. And when we're constantly, I think, exposed to that kind of strong stimulus, our sensitivities, our ability to feel kind of shrinks, because it's just trying to manage all that overwhelm, that sort of sensory overwhelm. So the dieta, and so diet, it means diet, the diet that they prescribe, do that as long as you can. Spend a lot of time in nature, those kinds of things. So the last one is reduce interactions with technology and spend time in nature to get a quiet mind and become grounded for the ceremony. So in the ceremony, my recommendations are simple. Relax the mind and be open and accepting of feelings. Surrender, surrender, surrender. And don't resist. Because I'll tell you, if you're in a ceremony and something comes up and you start resisting, it just builds and it gets worse. And if you just can be present for what's coming up, sometimes it can shift in literally seconds. I'm not kidding you. You can do the most incredible, deep, reconciling kind of work, like reconciling, your traumas in literally minutes. In literally minutes, it's incredible. So there's a quote, what you resist persists, and it's totally the case in ceremony. I've taken people to ceremony and nothing's really happened. They just laid there and felt sick all night because they weren't able to sort of really let go and let what needed to come up. So after the ceremony, you're going to want to create space for the aspects recovered from the emotional trauma by easing back into life. That means you need some time and space, and shifting as necessary to accommodate the desires, perspectives of these recovered aspects of your awareness. And last, participate in integration circles. I think these are becoming a bit more common. Lots of folks who are holding these kinds of ceremonies will kind of offer up integration circles to help people kind of deal with the aftermath of ceremony, so that you can help ground the innate awareness in your consciousness. So I'm sure people have lots of questions. This is my favorite part of this talk, actually, when people ask questions, because I've just offered up a lot, and you are all scientific minds, and I'm happy to answer any questions that people have.
All right, you have a question?
Hey, Dr.
Okay, great. Hey, how's it going? What's your name?
Nicholas
Sorry?
Denton.
Hi, Nicholas.
I thank you, first of all, for sharing everything. I think that was very powerful, and you gave I got out of an existentialist class today, so we were talking about identity disorders and stuff, and I think you really articulated everything about how that works and how you can possibly correct that in a way that I haven't seen been done anywhere. So I want to say thanks for that. And my question really is, what kind of advice would you have for medicinal chemists who are looking to, quote, normalize psychedelic therapy in the Western world? And I say that because we're all here because cannabis is legal now. And I realize you are speaking on ayahuasca, and there are ways to go out and to have the ceremonies and the rituals legally. But there are also a wide diversity of psychedelic plants and shamanic plants that have been used for a very long time, which frankly are completely unregulated. And I personally would be very all ears to any type of advice you would have on, I guess, like terms of networking with other professionals who are looking to do the same thing and facilitate those types of healing.
This is a great question, because really we're on that cusp right now, right? Like I was saying before we started, when we did this work in 2011, 2013, very few people were interested in this. It was very groundbreaking, and now it's everywhere. But I just actually reviewed a proposal this morning for for people wanting to do some research on ketamine and psilocybin. And what I said to there was a place in the forum where I could make comments just to the folks who were asking me to review this. And what I told them was, there's a lot of knowledge about how to do this work, but it's not codified in a way that mainstream, above board medical science can really accept, right? We have a very strict, I would say, and for good reason. We have a lot of hoops people have to jump through to prove something. But what we have to understand is that in other cultures, say in the Peruvian culture, the Shipibo culture, where this comes from, they've had, literally thousands of years of practice with this stuff. It reminds me a little bit kind of this, the medicine hunters. I know you guys have probably heard about these guys. They go out in the jungle, right, to find potentially therapeutic. And they talk to the natives. They talk to the people that are there because they have a sense of what's there and what they use it for to get clues. And it's kind of similar in that way. These folks have, thousands of years of practice using these medicines. And that's where ayahuasca, I think, has a leg up on a lot of the other stuff going on. Like, they have a technology and an approach. They get this. There's a great book I can recommend called The Fellowship of the River by Dr. Joe Tafur, who was a medical doctor who went down and got trained to do Shipibo medicine. And it's the best, it's not super well written because it was his first book, but it's the best description of what they're actually doing in ceremony. And what they're actually doing in ceremony is teaching themselves to have a reliable ability to see energetically into people, and they see the traumas, they see things, and then they can affect what they're watching, what they're seeing with sound. They use sound to affect it. So an example he gives in the book is he's doing ayahuasca with this woman's doing a ceremony with him. He looks into her. He sees little black dragons swimming. This is what he sees. I see little black dragons swimming in her DNA. Now, of course, she doesn't have little black dragons in her DNA. He's seeing a symbolic, right? A picture, some kind of depiction of her trauma. And then when he sees the trauma energetically, they sing, they chant, they have carols, they called, and they use the sound energy to affect what they're looking at, and they can see whether it's working. So they adjust the song, they adjust the chant until that's the one, that's going to get it. And when they get really good at it, and they've been doing it for a couple of decades, they know which song's going to work because they've done it so many times. So I guess my point would be, we as scientists, you as budding scientists, we all need to kind of humble ourselves in a certain sense to that our Western processes for understanding things aren't the only way to understand things. And these people have a science of psychedelics that we should borrow from, that we should try to try to figure out and bring into our systems. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We need to humble ourselves and say, these people know something we don't know. They're working in a space that our science doesn't even say is real, and having good effects, and they have for centuries. So that's what I would say. We need to adjust our approaches to things as much as we need to, as we attempt to bring ayahuasca into the modern world medicine. Hope I answered that.
Yeah, we have another question.
Okay.
Greetings, doctor.
Hey.
I'm very well versed in services that allow for psychedelic experiences in Peru or elsewhere. I was wondering if you might be able to let us know of some trustworthy ones if any of us might be interested in arranging for a ceremony.
Where are you guys at? You're in northern Michigan?
Yes, sir.
Is that where you're at, Michigan?
It's northern Michigan, the Upper Peninsula, Marquette.
Okay, yes. So what I'll do is I'll put out to my networks, because I know people who are working in the underground space, and I'll ask if they know of folks in your area. And I can't personally vouch for the people they're going to recommend, but all the people I know are good. So I have some trust of what they're going to recommend. And what's that?
I was just gonna say, what about outside of the local sphere, like even places in Peru or perhaps like just,
Yeah, I have some places I can recommend down there too, but let me just sit with that because I want to go just make sure I get it right. I have people I can ask. So yeah, I'll make a note here and I can send it to Darren and he can share with the group.
oh, excellent.
Just want to get that right. So safe sources. I recently did ketamine for the first time. I don't know if anybody's ever done a breakthrough dose of ketamine. It was fascinating, and that's a unique substance because it's actually a legal pharmaceutical. And there are, I'm sure, probably even in your area, there may be places that are opening up to provide that experience. And it's a different drug. It's a dissociative, not a serotogenic psychedelic. So I always was really curious, like, because my understanding, which I've just shared with you about how these actually help with healing, is they take us right into our feelings, not disassociate. You know what I mean? So I always had this thought in my head, like, how can a disassociative actually be therapeutic if it's not helping us get into our traumas and reconcile them and feel them and express them? So when I did it, it was fascinating because it was incredible. Like, it was an intramuscular in the hip, 120 milligrams of ketamine. I was like, in a minute and 38, I said to the woman, "Here it comes." And within 30 seconds, I was completely completely ego death, like off in fractal land, dancing with the fractals, like incredible experience. It happens so fast. And that's the thing about ayahuasca, in the ceremony, it kind of comes and goes. You're in it heavy and it comes down, and you can always have a second or third drink if you need to do that. But it's a kind of in and out. In the ketamine space, I just was like, boom, 100% ego dissolution, dancing in fractal land. And it lasted about 25 minutes, and then I slowly came out. But I had a therapeutic experience, but it wasn't at all like what I've experienced on like what I just shared with you on the serotogenic psychedelics. It was more kind of hard to explain, but it was more kind of, I could see where it would be therapeutic for people who have like disordered brain stuff going on, like serious depression or anxiety, where you're kind of locked into a brain loops that aren't helpful, because you get a 25-minute break from that. You're not that for 25 minutes. It's like rebooting your brain kind of in some sense, right? But there was another aspect, and that was a kind of being able to really access what I would call is the resiliency of our souls. Like, I was Teflon Gerald in that experience. Nothing I brought up in my mind that was an issue in my life or at work, or the main message was like, look, not to worry, like everything's fine, you got this, you know what I mean? So I was able to hold on to that sense of resiliency for several weeks afterwards, like just like Teflon, like I'm fine, world's fine, I'm good, right? COVID, nah, not to worry, everything's fine.
Mhm.
And that also, I think, would be therapeutic. So I guess what I'm saying is, I'm kind of convinced that ketamine actually has some therapeutic potential. And I had a really interesting experience at the end of that. And that's legally available. You can just go find a clinic. Yeah, I think maybe you probably have to, if you're, you have to show them that you have something that you're working with, like depression or whatever. But I think you could access that legally, so it wouldn't require you going to like a underground kind of experience. I don't know if there's clinics in your area for sure, but I know they're popping up all over the States now, mainly for depression, I think. So
No doubt. Cool, yeah. Any sort of resources to trusted places? Because I know I've heard some stories about people who go to Peru with what they thought was an ayahuasca retreat, and it was like some shady stuff. So I can
yeah.
be useful.
Yeah, there has been some shady stuff going on, and it's just kind of the way the world is, right? Money and all of that. And now that it's kind of global, there's thousands and thousands of people going down there. So of course you're going to have some shady stuff going on. So yeah, I can help with that.
Well, we appreciate that. Thank you, sir.
Sure. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure.
So, so yeah, you were like talking about this, this act of like surrendering, whenever you're on these substances, and like I guess like I do agree with that, but like I was wondering like, so do you think that like people who don't surrender, like essentially like, they don't get the full experience? Because like, yeah, like in my like experiences, I've never done ayahuasca, but like psilocybin, like I've taken some and I've had a good experience, but maybe like a friend or someone would like not would not be able to like surrender. So like the whole time they're like, I'm not feeling anything, I'm not feeling anything. And like for them, they don't like feel anything, but like I guess like do you know if there's any like research or like anything of like why, like what in the brain sort of like makes people not feel that experience, like simply because they're rejecting it so hard? Like I don't know, like what I'm trying to say, or
I do, yeah. So what I would say is a couple things. First of all, this idea of a bad trip results from basically you going into a challenging experience and it's being surfaced by the process I just described and not surrendering to it, not allowing it to express and resolve, right? Because if the other thing that happens in ayahuasca I didn't talk about is I've never done it, is purging, is the throwing up, which is another way of moving the energy that I just described. It's not going into the feeling the way that I did it. It's basically you just throw up. This happened to my wife when she did ceremony, and what she said to me was the buildup to it was one of the scariest things she's experienced. And after she purged, she felt better than she had ever felt in her entire life. Like those few minutes right after the purge, she felt better. So it is about surrendering, but what you have to understand is that our minds are very, very powerful. Our minds affect our reality in very fundamental ways. And it's that top-down projection that's interpreting what we're seeing and giving it meaning, which is all a useful thing. But if you're not working to blend your awareness, to bring your feeling self into and look at our culture cultivates this in us. Our phones, our lifestyles, everything is about that sort of prefrontal conscious cortex. So you have to cultivate the capacity to feel. This is where cultivating your sensitivity is really important, right? Watch for those strong stimuluses, because when you're exposing yourself to those strong stimuluses, your feeling self is shrinking back. It's a lot of violence, all of that, strong flavored foods even. All of that is a way to compress your sensitivity, because it has to shrink back to kind of. So yeah, it is the. So there are drugs that your ego can't resist. You guys have heard of DMT, I'm sure, right? Like that's the active ingredient in ayahuasca. It just is a very different form because it's orally active, which most DMT is, your body has an enzyme that breaks it down instantaneously. Most of our food has minute amount of DMT, and so our bodies have created an enzyme that basically deactivated DMT when we take it orally. So when you smoke toad venom, you've probably been watching what's going on with Tyson and other things. When you smoke that, you can smoke enough of that it doesn't matter who you are, what your brain is, it will blast you completely out and you'll have a really serious experience. So I know somebody who used to do work with people who sees that I prefer DMT because I don't have to mess around with people's egos. I don't have to wait for them to surrender and feel stuff. It just takes them there and then we can do the work. But with ayahuasca, psilocybin, these are a bit gentler, and you got to cultivate some ability to work with the medicine. I'll tell you a story about my daughter who was 19 or 20 at the time. I took her to her first ceremony, and so she doses and I dose, and after about 45 minutes, I'm getting into my trip, and she taps me on the shoulder and says, "Dad, I don't feel anything." And I was just like, because I was already like blasting off, right? I was just like, well, okay. So I said to her, well, you could always go get more, because that's an option. You can go up and ask for more. And then as an afterthought, I said to her, oh, but you also have to invite the medicine in. And she said to me, as soon as I said those words, like the instant I said those words, she thought about it and boom, it came on. So how do you explain that? Like this, if you're all about the pharmacology, if you're all about what the DMT is doing to your brain chemistry, how do you explain that her just realizing that she needed to open to the medicine completely shifted it, and she was blasted off, right? Like literally in seconds. So yeah, there's basically what I would suggest is if we learned how to interact with the challenging aspects of trips, we wouldn't ever call it a bad trip. It's actually, that's the nugget. That's where you're going to go do your best work. When you're in a psychedelic experience and you're feeling uncomfortable, go right into it. Like literally just that's where you put your emphasis. Go right into that, right? And surrender. And but the crazy thing is, if you're not ready for it, if you don't have the capacity to be present for what you don't want to feel, good luck, because your mind can just boom, lock it right out, and you won't have an experience, and you'll just lay there feeling like shit all night. Or can. The other thing I want to say, mention what you just talked about, was that, you know, I'm describing one half of what I consider to be the gifts of these medicines. That is that ability to access what you need to access to heal, that your mind's not wanting you to do. The other half is really connecting you to your divine nature. I know it sounds crazy, but you have these experiences where you actually feel your true nature, and you will never be the same. You will never look at life the same. You will never experience a relationship the same. You will never, life is completely altered because you have a sense of your eternal nature. You have a sense of you know, that actually the source code, what's behind all of this, is love. And when you feel that in your heart, like, and no one can ever take that from you. It will never go away. It will never go. So that's the other gift, is connecting to all that is and realizing you're a divine being having a human experience. And yeah, it's pretty hard at times, but in that hardness is also, you know, opportunity for growth. Changes everything. Changed me. So I only talked about half of the gifts. The other half comes after you do the work. Sometimes right after. There's in ayahuasca, there's a phrase we call the download. Sometimes after you do a bit of heavy lifting in the emotional space, you'll just, like, your awareness just explodes, and you understand so much, and you experience so much, you see so much. It's hard to even describe it.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yeah, what about so I don't know if you heard like the new research that's been coming out where they've been able to like make you know, some like synthetic chemicals, and basically they are psychoactive, but they don't actually give you the like hallucinogen experience, but they're saying that that it does still like you know, do the serotonin effect and stuff. So it does work, but it doesn't give you the actual experience. Like what do you think about that? Like, do you think that there definitely probably is a difference from just taking the actual you know, either the toad or the plant, like, or
I do.
yeah.
I do, and I'll explain it this way, because ayahuasca is unique in my experience with the psychedelics, because there is an energy associated with ayahuasca that most people who take it feel. It's feminine, and she comes to you. I've had actually direct physical sensations in ceremony of somebody working on my body, and sat up and there was nobody there. Laid back down, it happened again, sat up, nobody was there. It was crazy. And that's different. I haven't had that experience with any of the other psychedelics, not even the toad. I didn't have any presence there to sort of assist me. So that one's is kind of unique. This idea that we can kind of engineer out the difficult parts, I think that's what some folks are trying to do. Engineer out is kind of missing the point. The point is to create a circumstance where you go into the difficultness and you resolve it. That's kind of the point. Right? If you engineer out the challenging aspects, you're engineering out, as far as I'm concerned, engineering out that potential. And I think it's for greed. I think these companies are essentially trying to create analogs that then they can patent and make money from. And I'm not sure that's really what should be driving this, right? This is it's hard to convey it in a situation like this, but these are very sacred experiences. First time I did ayahuasca, that's what I remember just over and over in my mind, thinking about how deeply sacred this work was and how it needed to be sort of protected from the vulgarities of capitalism and all the rest, because somebody's going to come in here and just try to make $1 billion, right? Because there's a lot of people suffering in the world, and yeah, we need to help them, but we got to make it so it's not about the money as the driving force, in my view. Otherwise, you're gonna pollute it all. But the idea that yeah, you know, there are analogs of drugs that have various effects, which I think that kind of chemistry, that kind of science is useful. I know people in that space actually who work on analogs and designer drugs and that kind of stuff. And now there's a whole kind of new movement in the psychedelic space of what's called stacking. You guys know this, where you're actually combining substances and working with them kind of sequentially or otherwise to have a kind of engineer the experience for a specific outcome. So there's a lot of innovation going on in that space. So I think there's room for innovation, and I think there's room for creativity and all of that. I just think we need to think very deeply about what's important, what we value. And, you know, in some ways you got to make it kind of financially viable because that's what runs the world. But we, you know, that should be like a second or third or fourth order kind of, you know, value here rather than what's going to drive things. And so I'm a little bit worried about some of that, to tell you the truth.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it could definitely be a problem if it's in the wrong hands. Especially without the proper education and, you know, like more of the shamanic, you know, rather than just taking it and saying this is gonna work.
Well, I know people in the corporate space on psychedelics who, one company I can't name, but they basically require all of their executives and board members to take trips. Right? Yeah, they make them all work with a particular practitioner I know who is really good. Her specialty is ketamine, but she does other things too. But yeah, they're all required to basically have the experience if they're going to participate in the company, which is quite interesting if you think about it.
Yeah, that's true.
Any other questions? I'm happy to answer if there's more.
Any other questions? Yeah, I think that's it. Seems like.
Okay, so I'll so again that book that I mentioned, just so I can re-mention, it's really worth reading if you're interested in kind of the medical application of in this case ayahuasca, but I think it's relative to other psychedelics too. It's called The Fellowship of the River by Dr. Joe Tafur, Tafur. Highly recommend that. And remind me, Darren, please send me an email saying what I said I would give you. Some safe places in Peru and other places. I'll just do a little bit of research amongst my network and get you some good recommendations. I might even be able to find someone in your area. Usually when I put it out to my network, I can get pretty close within a state or so. So then you wouldn't have to travel to Peru if you wanted to do it. But we'll see. I've never been asked about Michigan. So, and where are you guys at exactly?
We're like in the Upper Peninsula. We're like 2 hours from the Canadian border.
Oh, okay.
So, Yeah, and it's about like probably like 7 hours to Toronto.
Okay, yeah, there's definitely people in that space I could probably find. I think I know somebody who actually, I think he may have retired actually from leading ceremony after about 20 years. But anyway, I'll do my best. If you can just send me an email to remind me, otherwise I might forget.
Okay,
Anyway,
yeah, I will. And
okay,
actually, I do have a question though.
okay.
So like for any of us that are like interested in getting involved in like psychedelic research or clinical trials, like do you have any like tips or anything like that?
Well, there's so much of that going on. You guys probably know about the clinical trial database. If you can go and search there, you can find where this research is going on. There's definitely hot spots in Europe and in the States. But I'm not a hard scientist, right? I'm not a chemist. I'm not even a clinical researcher. So you got to have certain skills, right? What I would say to people who are interested in getting into the research on psychedelics is just plant a seed that, in my experience, we're going to have to adjust our science a little bit for these medicines. Because a lot of what goes on in the medical space when they're researching drugs is really trying to identify a molecule that they can patent and make money from, and right, that's going to have a specific effect on the body, da 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 da. And yeah, these drugs have specific effects, but it's actually the experience that they bring you rather than the drug itself, which is creating the therapeutic. If you see my point, I kind of go back to my talk there. So it's a different kind of thing. It necessarily involves subjective effects, placebo, whatever you want to call it, right? There are things happening in the mind, body, spirit complex with these experiences. I think it's the recovery of consciousness. I think we're actually, helping ourselves to be more. To have more awareness and recovering it from trauma, and so you're growing, your awareness is growing, and I think that's what's happening. But I mean, I need to write something about this because I've been meaning to, but I haven't had a chance lately. But yeah. So if you do get interested in it and you become a scientist and you find your way into that world, just back of your mind, I'm planting a seed here. We need to adjust to the medicines rather than bring the medicines into our kind of our science. I think we need to innovate and come up with neat new ways to kind of understand what's happening here, and it will challenge our kind of reductionist mechanistic kind of understandings of ourselves, of biology. Another book I can recommend that I recently read was called The Science Delusion. You're all scientists, you might get into this. So this is actually a very accomplished scientist. He was a biologist who had some breakthroughs actually, I think in the 50s and 60s when he was doing his research. And he wrote a book called The Science Delusion. And it's a fabulous read, because what he does is he looks into various aspects of kind of modern science and kind of goes right to the edge of what we think we know. And really shows in a number of important places where we have assumptions about how reality works that isn't actually how reality works. It's the sort of, mechanistic universe versus the quantum universe is part of what he's describing. And I don't think we've done our due diligence to really kind of think about what the human body, the human experience, our awareness, our consciousness, what all that is in outside of a mechanistic kind of view of the body. And if we take, physics seriously, quantum physics seriously, it has to have implications for us because we're part of physical reality. You know what I mean? So anyway, that's another great book. It's called The Science Delusion. The author, I can't remember his name. But yeah, it's a good, for scientists, I think it's a good read because it'll humble you. It'll give you a sense of where there are assumptions in science that may not actually kind of hold when we look at reality. So.
Yeah, well, don't want to hold you up too long, but
Okay.
yeah, thank you so much for doing this talk. It was very insightful. It was very different from what we're used to. We're always talking about science and So it's good to get like a whole different perspective and trying to look outside the box and stuff like that.
Yeah, I would say don't just look outside the box, experience outside the box, because it's totally possible. Get
Yeah,
out there, feel into life in a way that you're not accustomed to, because there's a lot more to it than most of us understand,
for sure.
including a bit of magic, actually, if you're open to that. Okay. So send me an email so I don't forget, and I'll send you some things.
All right.
Okay.
Well,
Okay.
thank you.
You're very welcome. See you guys later. Bye.
Have a good one.